All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. We're under the Tools and Testing, Understanding Client-Side JavaScript Frameworks, Framework Main Features. And as mentioned there, every major JavaScript framework has a different approach to updating the DOM, handling browser events, etc., providing a more usable or enjoyable developer experience. This article will explain the main features of the big four frameworks. So we will go over these, but I will talk about things that are specific to what we cover in the AWD 1111 database-driven web development class. And I'm going to skip basically, again, the Ember, the Vue, and the Angular specific stuff. So, domain-specific languages. All of the frameworks discussed in this module are powered by JavaScript and allow you to use DSLs. All right, it says React has the use of JSX, whereas Ember utilizes Handlebars. We'll actually talk about Handlebars as well in here. All right, unlike HTML, these languages know how to read data variables, and this data can be used to streamline the process of writing your user interface. Angular apps often make heavy use of TypeScript, again, which I'm not going to talk about. DSLs can't be read by the browser directly. They must be transformed into JavaScript or HTML first. This transformation is an extra step in the developer process, but typically it's built into the tool itself. All right, so JSX, and again, this is always interesting because as it says, JSX stands for JavaScript and XML. It's an extension of JavaScript that brings HTML-like syntax to a JavaScript environment. It was invented by the React team, and again, remember, React is about 7 years old, developed by Facebook, for use in React applications, but can be used to develop in other applications as well. So when you look at this, it says the following here shows an JSX example. Well, forget about this for just a second. Forget about this and forget about this. What do we have here? Well, this looks somewhat, at least, similar to just regular HTML. It's a header with an H1 in it. So what's different? Well, it has a variable in here where we can pass in a subject. So in this case, it's going to say hello world, but it's possible we could pass in something else here. If I put my name in there, it would say hello Jeff. All right, and we're creating we are creating basically, in this case, we are creating two different constants. The first one is the first line, and the second one is what I have there in blue. As it says, this expression represents an HTML header element with an H1 element inside of it. The curly braces tell the application to read this value as a constant and put it into the system. When used with React, it says it will be compiled to look like this. Now that basically looks like JavaScript. The difference is this line was created for us. And when ultimately rendered by the browser, it's going to look like this. Now, again, I have mentioned this to you previously, but I'm going to say it again. And last fall, so the fall of 2020, was the first time the AWD 1111 database-driven web development class was taught using Node.js. All right. At the time, we spent the last week or two of the class going over React, just going over basically a kind of a canned project. All right, why am I telling you this? Well, as the class is going forward, React is going to become more and more important. In fact, the hope is to introduce React into the AWD 1000 class at the end of the semester. But previously, when we taught the class last time, one of the tools that was used in there was Handlebars. And as you can see, Handlebars is not specific to Ember. Again, the code resembles HTML, but it has the option of pulling data in it from elsewhere. Like JSS, it uses curly braces. So this looks very similar to what we had before. All right, so here we had single curly braces inside of the H1, and here we've got double curly braces. All right, and basically, again, that's going to render something that looks like this. The only thing I'm trying to tell you is that I have looked at handlebars before. All right. All right, TypeScript I'm going to skip. Maybe I shouldn't be, but I am anyway. So let's go down to writing components. As mentioned in the previous chapter, most frameworks have some kind of a component model. React components are typically written with JSX, Ember with Handlebars, Angular and Vue. It says with a templating syntax that extends HTML. Regardless of their opinions on how the component should be written, each framework's components offer a way to describe the external properties that are necessary. The code snippets in the rest of this section will use React as an example, which is great because that's what we're using, and are written in JSX, so we will take a look at these. I don't know if we'll finish this in one tape or if it'll take a couple. All right, React works with properties, and they're called props. And as it says, props are external data that a component needs in order to render. Okay, now when you think about props, in a way you can kind of think of them as being kind of what they are parameters that are passed into functions. And what are parameters that are passed into functions? They're information that the function needs in order to be able to do its job. And we're talking about the same kind of thing here. So it says, suppose you're building a website for an online magazine, and you need to be sure that each contributing writer gets credit for their work. You might create a component called author credit for each article. This component needs to display a portrait of the author and a short byline about him or her. In order to know what image to render, the author credit needs to accept some props or properties. So here's the React representation of this. So the props are going to be basically, in this case, the image, the figure, which is going to have the image in it, all right, and some kind of a caption. So as it says here, props.source, props.alt, and props.byline represent where our props will be inserted into the component. To render this, we would write code like this where we wanted it rendered. This will ultimately render the following figure element. So again, what we're talking about doing is using a framework like React that will write some of the code internally for us. Now, it's a good news, bad news. The good news is it'll write some of the code for us. So that's less work than we have to do. The bad news is we have to learn how to use it. All right. So as it says, this will ultimately render the following figure element in the browser with its structure defined in the author credit component. All right. As it says, we talked about the concept of state in an earlier chapter. A robust state handling mechanism is a key to an effective framework. Each component may have data that needs its state controlled. State will persist in some way as long as the component is in use. Like props, state can be used to affect how a component is rendered. And when you think about it, state kind of drives everything. And what I mean is, for example, for a human being, my state at any one time, would include things like my height, my weight, but my state also right now would include the fact that I'm awake. All right. As an example here, it says, consider a button that counts how many times it's been clicked. The component should be responsible for tracking its own count state and would be written like this. This use state that you see right here is an example of what's known as a React hook. And again, you'll notice here when you look at this stuff, as I mentioned before, is commented up the wazoo. And in this case, there are links to React hooks if you want more. It says, given an initial data, it'll keep track of that value as it's updated. So initially in the browser, it would say something like this. After you clicked it, it would change to click 1 times, etc. The use state keeps track of the count in a robust way across the app. It's another thing you don't have to worry about doing. And it's not that you couldn't do it yourself. If we wanted to put in our own hit counter, so every time somebody came into our site, we wanted to say this site has been visited 37 times, and the next time 38 times, etc. You could write something like that if you wanted to using JavaScript. Events. In order to be interactive, components need ways to respond to browser events, so the application can respond to the users. Frameworks each provide their own syntax for listening to browser events, which reference the names of the equivalent native browser events. In React, listening for a click event requires a special property, onClick. Which we're setting right here. In this version, as it says, we're using additional useState functionality to create a special setCount function. All right, which, as you can see, in the line that's in blue is invoked there. And it should be adding the 1 to the current value each time that is clicked. Each framework offers a way to define styles for your components or for the application as a whole. Although each framework's approach is different slightly, all of them basically give you more than one way of doing the same thing. All major frameworks provide mechanism for handling dependencies. All right, the exact mechanism will differ between frameworks, but the end result is the same. As it says, components tend to import components into other components using a standard JavaScript module syntax or something similar. One key benefit of this is that components can be composed together. Just like you can write HTML tags and nest them inside of one another to build a website, you can use components inside of one another to help build your application. And they give an example here. It says our author credit React component might be utilized inside of an article component. All right. Real-world applications can involve a lot of nesting. All right, and they're giving an example here. Our app component has data inside of that the author component needs, etc. It says we could rewrite home and article so that they pass the props down, but this could get tedious after a while when you keep going more and more and more heavily into this. It says the problem with passing data through multiple layers is called prop drilling, and it's not ideal for large applications. To circumvent this, frameworks provide functionality known as dependency injection, which is a way to get data directly passed to the components that need it without having to worry about passing it from here to here to here to here, etc. Each framework implements dependency injection under a different name and in a different way. All right, React has the context API, which is what we'll care about. All right, we don't have too much left in here, so let's finish this up. In the context of a framework, as it says here, a component's life cycle is a collection of phases that the component goes through from the time it's appended to the DOM and then rendered by the browser. Each framework names these life cycle phrases differently, and not all give developers access to it in the same way. The render phrase, as mentioned right there, is the most crucial to understand because it's repeated the most times as your user interacts with the application. It's run every time the browser needs to render something new. So here's a diagram of it. All right. And I'm not going to go over any of it right now. So just as with life cycles, frameworks take different but similar approaches to how they render applications. All right, because frameworks make decisions for you, you typically do not interact with the DOM yourself. It's abstracted away from you into what's known as a virtual DOM. All right. As it says, the virtual DOM is an approach whereby information about your browser's DOM is stored in JavaScript memory. Your application updates this copy of the DOM, then compares it to the quote real unquote DOM, the one actually rendered to users, in order to decide what to render. And there's another article there if you care to read more about this. There's an incremental DOM. As it says, it's similar to the virtual DOM in that it builds a DOM diff to decide what to render, but it's different and it doesn't require a complete copy. It ignores the parts of the DOM that don't need to be changed. All right. Routing. As mentioned in previous chapters, routing is an important part of the web experience to avoid a broken experience. All right, each framework covered in this module provides a library that helps developers implement client-side routing in their applications. Testing, of course you must test. Each framework has its own extensive tools and its ecosystem to do this. Testing library is a suite of utilities that has tools for several JavaScript environments, including React. So here they're giving a test for that counter button using the React testing library. As it says, it tests a number of things. Does it even exist? All right, does it explain, does it give you the right answer after it's been clicked a number of times? So that was quick. As it says, at this point you should have an idea about some of this stuff. So remember, with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that follow here, we're going to jump right into React next, and that's the only one of these 5 that are here that I'm going to go into. So I can now close this. We have now gone through getting started with the web, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, the web forms, the accessibility, and we're in the tools and testing, but we've gone through client-side web development tools and the introduction to client-side frameworks. So we're going to do React next and then jump all the way down to Git and GitHub and then do the client or the cross-browser testing. All right, so that's what we have to look forward to. And again, the only last thing I want to mention is I'm going to go through these. I have, at best, limited experience with React, so I'm going to be learning it along with students. So if it seems very elementary and very introductory, that's really all I wanted to get across for right now. Be back with React in a bit.